Okay, so starting book club session one, just so everyone knows, like it's a little bit weird kind of going into something more professional or anything like that, but more interpersonally, this is the book that we're reading, Secret Formulas of the Wizard of Ats. We're about 50 pages in. We read all of part one, and it's a very easy read, very simple, and I think that's kind of like one of your biggest statements about it, to be honest, but we'll kind of get into that here in a moment. That having been said, though, the first half hour generally of these kinds of meetings will be about the book, and then the last half hour will be how it applies, more or less. That's generally how this is kind of going to work. And then, yeah, so let's kind of jump into it. We weren't actually recording when we initially started talking, so did you want to, like, recap what you said about the tone of the book?
Boo, no. Okay, yeah, I can do that. So, the tone of the book, very, laid back, kind of interpersonal, very conversational, I guess is a better way to put it. I just went on a whole, 10-minute diatribe about this, so sorry.
10-minute diatribe.
But it feels like marketing is very, when you're marketing to an extent services and products especially, it can get very standardized, formulaic, inauthentic even, but also just very boring and plain, and that's oftentimes reflected in a lot of the instructional materials, long form blog posts, books, this, that, or the other. The interest and allure that marketers are trying to capture within their advertisements does not often translate well into the actual advertisements that they're making, or into the books that they're making to help other people make advertisements. Yeah, coffee's still kicking in, but
Yeah, and honestly, I kind of agree because I feel like our industry has become so marketed. Become a marketer. You can help people gain millions. You can get millions on your own. Have an agency, the 7-figure path or whatever. All of these different aspects that sound really wonderful, and they're all doing exactly what marketing teaches you. Like speak to the after, speak to the emotional state. And in order to get people to attend a thing, we also walk that talk. We eat our own dog food. But I kind of feel like what that ends up doing ultimately is once you get to the nitty gritty and you start wanting to teach someone, it gets completely bogged down in all of these not very interesting stories or paths. Here's how you do this thing, here's what you do, and none of it is actually thorough or well thought out, and it takes the magic out of learning how to do marketing.
well, there's also, it's a very important point to note that a lot of marketers, a lot of people in marketing are not marketers, I guess, and that when we were chatting about your time at your place of work and my time at my former place of work, you said something along the lines of, I'm not a better marketer than most of the people I've worked with because I'm a particularly great marketer. Like, I'm a better marketer than them because I pay attention and actively try to be a decent marketer, which a lot of people don't do, which is a very important thing to remember, that a lot of these people who are, accomplished marketers that are trying to teach other people, just because they're an accomplished marketer doesn't necessarily mean that they are great at marketing. It means that they stand head and shoulders above everyone else that is trying to get into the industry, who might not have training, who might not put in effort in their job, who might not just keep up with current trends. And so it's also pretty important to note that a lot of the people that are writing these books are not what we would typically view as marketers. They're occasionally, I don't want to say often or most times or put any qualifiers on it other than occasionally, but occasionally people who found a formula that worked for them and are trying to teach other people, even though it's boring, it's samesies, it's not quote unquote, I'm gonna sound a little purist or elitist here, but it's not quote unquote real marketing. And I feel like that's kind of where Wizard of Ads breaks this mold, is he's very much kind of a salesman in terms of how he thinks and talks and all of that, and that has translated fairly well into a book on marketing, obviously because of the overlap there.
I feel like every page that I read is just dripping with identity, curiosity, an established understanding that we're not just talking about these things because it will lead you to seven figures. We're talking about these things because they're fun, because this is how humans work, and it's phenomenal to learn that. I feel like the difference between this book and most other marketing books in general is that the marketing books all have this goal, all have this end thing in sight, and they won't stop talking about the end thing. And instead, this book says, at the end of every page, you learned a thing. And I think that that's kind of what captures my interest so much with this. And to know that there's 3 books in this series, like, it kind of warms my heart to know that he really felt that this was so important that he create a voice that really honestly speaks to marketers and doesn't take all of the it puts seriousness into it, but it doesn't take itself seriously, and I think that that's sorely lacking and missing in the world of DIY help yourself books when it comes to the marketing industry.
Well, it's even like the first 40 or 50 pages, part 1 of this, none of it is particularly groundbreaking information. I don't think I actually learned a whole lot from it that I didn't pick up on my own after, a couple years being in the industry or whatever. But at the same time, the way he phrases it and the way he approaches topics, like, even though they're topics I have a whole lot of experience with, like, the way he approaches it makes it a topic that I'm interested in hearing about his opinion on. The 3 cows in particular I thought was a wonderful analogy.
Yeah.
And I couldn't even tell you, I know there was, I couldn't even tell you what the 3 cows were necessarily. I just know kind of what he was going for. That's what I remember is what he was going for in that section. And that's kind of changing the way that we're looking at marketing being just this qualitative, cast a wide net, quantitative rather, sorry, cast as wide a net as you can and capture the attention of as many people as many times as possible. And he goes, no, that's dumb. That's a great way to get, millions of people to kind of be familiar with your name, but no one's actually going to engage with that. And what's very interesting about that is it very much went against all of the jobs that I had in marketing, in terms of, like, it was all about impressions. It was all, clicks were important, but that was secondary to impressions, because if people weren't seeing you, they wouldn't click, was the mindset. There was conversation about improving click rate and everything like that, stopping people from bouncing, because my marketing experience is solely digital, not solely, but mostly digital. There was conversation about how to improve the content of your actual site or feed or what have you to get people invested, but for the most part it was very much about making people aware you were there. And I always agreed with him that wasn't necessarily the most efficient way to go about marketing, because congratulations, you reached 1 million people, 100 of them clicked on your link, no one engaged. I would much rather reach 100,000 people, but have that 100, that same 100 people click and engage. Like, that's so much more valuable than playing a numbers game. And I really enjoy that he seemed to not only have deep love and desire for marketing as a discipline, but that he didn't forget that KPIs were not all that you were going for in marketing, which is something that I think a lot of us kind of miss the forest for the trees sometimes as far as metrics go, which we have done many a podcast on.
Yeah, and we won't bring work into it necessarily, but because we're recording this, to be clear, it's on page 16 called Dead Cows Everywhere, and the 3 sacred cows of advertising are demographic targeting, cross-rating points, and media mix. And one of the most important parts about this passage, I definitely agree with you, is this idea that we've kind of started to view our communities and our audiences as a numbers game, as livestock in some way, shape, or form. And we've forgotten that cashing in on social currency requires that we build social currency.
I think there's a problem. I just want to, sorry, I'll let you talk at some point this morning, I promise. But I just wanted to step in and say that there's a very intentional move towards making these people not even livestock, but just straight up numbers, because there are a lot of very predatory practices going on in marketing, as I'm sure we're all intimately familiar with. And it's a lot easier to do that when you're just seeing numbers on a screen go up and you're not considering that the old person who got fooled into thinking that the product that you're marketing was going to improve their quality of life, when it was very much not meant to work that way. It's a lot easier to step away from the consequences of what you are helping to market if you're not getting any personalized feedback, if the data is all quantitative, none of it is qualitative, and you're just not dealing with that aspect of marketing.
Yeah, and I also feel like, truth be told, that takes the fun out of being a marketer, right? Like, a lot of people love numbers, but like one of my favorite things, I heard this from Chris Mercer, was no one is a numbers person. When you think of or find a numbers person, the person doesn't like numbers. They can just more easily understand and connect the abstraction of the numbers to a real, verifiable, worldly thing. And it's the thing that they're interested in. I feel like the world of learning about marketing has forgotten that fact. Forgotten the fact that building a funnel or bringing in income or calculating your ROI or name as many things as possible, they're just so disconnected from being human. And I feel like a really great example of that is clickbait, where like we have like 7 ways to do X, or 10 ways you're missing out on this money, or something along those lines. That's very much a numbers game to get someone to click, but in all reality, you're not building content that has a narrative, that has a story, that really hits home.
And that's why I think that as many problems as I have with it being the monolith it is today, I think Google is making a lot of strides kind of in the right direction with trying to prioritize organic content versus pay-per-click content. It could be very easy for them to, we were kind of talking about gladiators fighting in separate stages in terms of like SEO results, but we were talking about that in the context of structured data versus those that don't take the time and effort to insert, structured data to let Google know what's going on within the page. It could be very easy for them to have added to kind of larger meta arenas to that, basically those that invest 10 grand a month into pay-per-click versus those who do not, and they haven't, which I'm sure is something that they've considered and something that they're not doing because they would lose a lot of engagement and people would, flock away from them in droves. But at the same time, I do have to admit that while it's probably not coming from altruism, because Google, the fact that they have still made it kind of that, not Wild West free for all, but given the appearance that it is still that way, is one of the best things they could have done for their kind of own self-image and marketing. As much as people get on them for controlling narratives and this, that, or the other, in theory, anyone can prosper provided the masses see their website, their content, whatever, as authoritative and basically useful. And that's something that I'm going off on a tangent and I kind of forgot where, but that's something that we constantly talk about Google being the largest, qualitative study in history. Mm-hmm. And that's one of my favorite parts about it, is that it really is this ingeniously wonderful tool for marketing if you can use it properly. And I think this book gives you tools on how to use it properly, and that's not just seeing how many of what type of people are interested in your stuff and exploiting the ever-loving hell out of that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I kind of minding time, I kind of feel like we've talked about the tone and mm-hmm. we've talked about the three cows. There was one particular passage that I really, really enjoyed because it reminded me a lot of things that I learned in the nonprofit space. So this was on page 24, chapter 8 on category dominance. And it was this idea that the whole point of branding or being a business is to achieve a certain level of success. But what exactly does that success mean? And conversely, if you break down this understanding of what category dominance is, why would a population, a target audience, choose to make you the dominant one? I feel like that's a question marketers aren't asking themselves. They always say you got to beat your competitors, you've got to come to the top of your space. But the way that the passage ends, I think, is just so perfect. Category dominance can be achieved only through focus with commitment. Will you be category dominant? If so, you must take a stand and be known for something. What will you be known for? And that kind of reminds me of a message that Ryan Dice provided at Traffic and Conversion Summit. He said, if you want to matter, create a movement. And I feel like that encapsulates the change between traditional marketing, the growing pains of this digital marketing space and its abuse and its black hat uses, and into what seems to be like a burgeoning dawn of marketing as community development in online spaces.
I think it's important to note, though, that you hit the nail on the head. Community has to be involved in that. Mm-hmm. Or you'll get something else where, like, look at Pride Month, where when it is financially advantageous for them to do so, companies will switch logos to pride flags and essentially do nothing else. Where it's not advantageous for them to do so, they'll do absolutely nothing. So I think that now that we have the tools and we're seeing that it is a viable method of marketing, community managers are going to be, I mean, not the next big thing, because they already are kind of the next big thing, but
thanks, COVID.
Not that I'm biased there at all, but I think that it's very important in separating, so-called rainbow capitalism, where these companies pursue, is clout what the kids are still calling it these days? Good God, I sound like a geezer. But pursue basically reputation to acquire a following, like with the whole Wendy's Twitter debacle and personalizing companies and all that, versus, I can't think of a good one off the top of my head, you'd probably have a better idea than I would, companies that are effectively utilizing building and working with communities for not just sales, but bettering kind of the world around their product service. like industry as a whole sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I don't know. I definitely agree. And I kind of feel like the second part of that message is also really, really important. You have to actually stand for something. So, yeah, it's one thing for LinkedIn to change their logo and say, we support LGBTQ rights. That's not particularly controversial anymore. But the reality is, if you're not taking a stand as a company or as a business, you're not engaging in the one benefit businesses have in the United States. And that's a controversial one as it is. The fact that a company counts as a personhood. And if you're a person and you get all of those different advantages in your company, you also must root yourself in an ideological responsibility. I think that communities fail to do that, and in that way, they're not just leaving responsibility on their table, they're leaving group affiliation and community identity on the table.
I think it's important to realize when Rubio, or I think it was Rubio or whoever it was, said that companies were people, essentially. He was referring to it in a very narrow sense where basically they should be able to spend their money to elect people like me to pursue their interests. There's this push to make companies people. One, it's advantageous for them to be people, and then businesses, one, it's advantageous for them to be conglomerates. And it's very important to note that distinction and how that impacts their, not impact on community building, but how communities view them. And it's going to be very difficult for community managers to marriage this dichotomy that businesses are trying to fully encompass by, you know, putting on one hat when they are trying to get politicians elected to, you know, be it advantageous for their industry or whatever, and then put on the other hat when they're trying to appeal to individual people on Twitter like a Wendy's. And I think that that's something that community managers at large have not attempted to tackle. The fact that companies very much do have a responsibility towards people, and how to give people the tools to help them hold businesses accountable. Because it seems like there's a lot of basically corporate doublespeak that can alleviate them of responsibility that after however many years, like, people have kind of bought into. So I almost see marketers as the way that the industry is going is almost being not against the interests of the companies that employ them, but responsible for bringing up the voices of the communities around them and leveling out some of that discrepancy using tools that are available to us now. And it's that's not related to the book at all. I need to stop going on these tangents.
Well,
but
I think it is, though. Like, that's everything that Seeing Your Customers Real is about. You know, like page 30, chapter 13, Seeing Your Customers Real. Like, it ends with, in truth, I write this about life beyond business because your customers have a life, your employees have a life beyond business, you have a life beyond business. I write in the hope that you'll come to see yourself, your staff, and your customers real. And I think that really kind of perfectly encapsulates the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take it. That's not how I took that passage, but I mean, that was going back to your quote about numbers people not really existing. I had to laugh about that. I really want to hear Celine's opinion on that particular quote.
If you're recording, Celine is my partner. If you're recording.
Very much a stereotypical numbers person.
Yes. If you're watching the recording. Why was I stuck on that?
Because words are hard.
Yeah. She's very much so a numbers person, but the thing I find important is that she's my partner and I love her to death. Oftentimes, she will use a number to abstract a behavior and take away the notion of that behavior. One quintessential experience is she has a sleep chart. which I think is absolutely genius. So she actually has a chart that calculates the number of bits and packages running through the internet, with the notion that if the bits and packages are active, it means someone is transferring energy. And when they spike, it means she's awake because she's at her computer, she's working. And then when it plummets, it means she must be asleep or away from her computer. So it calculates screen time, but she uses it as a sleep chart, which is just a fascinating way to view the connection between numbers and behaviors.
Celine tracking her sleep time by whether or not she's at the computer is...
Just like her, right?
Yeah. I wish that surprised me more.
Yeah. Kind of getting back to topic, though, another thing that I really, really like about this book is that content is king. The book is so well written, but the best thing I like about this book is that they didn't forget that context is queen.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this book is beautiful, and it's gorgeous, and most importantly, all of the visual aspects of the book elaborate on and help the copy, help the content. One specific example is at the end of each chapter, there's the thing that you should have learned. And it's just like this hyper-salient visual representation of what something's about. And I think that a perfect example is just a quote by Albert Einstein that was placed at the end of this book that doesn't even mention him, not even once. He's just not mentioned. The quote itself is just so salient, though. This is on page 32, The Changing Face of the Rich, which is all about what it really means to get a seven-figure income and all of these things that are so popular in the marketing industry now. But the most important thing to learn from this chapter is summed up as, try not to become a man of success, but rather a man of value. I kind of feel like it's worth marinating on that quote a little bit as it pertains to community management specifically.
Well, I think it's important, like, look at it in context of, when was this book published?
So that's a weird thing, because as I understand it, this book was actually based off of a bunch of notes and stuff found by a guy who was doing copywriting in like the 80s or 90s, and he just posted it.
So that's...
it was published, officially speaking, in 1999.
But that's still, like, to the point that I'm trying to make. God, you're just talking so much.
You're allowed. It's a book club.
That's
the
funny
whole point is
because I'm hogging the conversation. But no, what that's almost prophetic because of the rise of, like, quote unquote influencers and this kind of, like, the lifestyle of the rich and famous.
yeah.
Those like that outside looking in kind of phenomenon that we've got going, where you have these people who I think day trading is the new thing, but before that it was it's gone back, like real estate, MLMs. There's been a time to shine in all of these, and they're like these, I'm not going to say fantastic because they're completely unethical, very effective marketing tactics that are, hey, pay me $500 and I'll teach you how to... I think actually pickup artists were the first people I noticed doing this. Pay me $500 to come to my seminar, get my book, get my master class, and I'll teach you how to sleep with all the hot chicks you want to, or start a 7-figure business, or this, that, and the other. Self-help gurus, I think, is a good way to kind of encompass all of these types of classes, programs, marketers. What it essentially is are incredibly effective marketing strategies. Like, you take these classes, I follow a guy on YouTube, CopyZilla, who kind of an uppity douchebag, but that's why he's so much funny, is because he's kind of an uppity douchebag against these people that are blatantly ripping people off. And he just tears into them, and he's arrogant and awful and terrible, but like against these people that absolutely deserve it. He looks like someone who in general I would love to have a beer with, but has no tolerance for assholes, essentially. And it's something that I think is really missing from the modern day kind of community management element, just not allowing people that are coming in here to poison these spheres. And it's just very interesting looking at success versus value. Like, you can have an hour-long YouTube video showing people your mansion, your Lamborghini, you know, the hot models that you're partying with. Dan Blazarian. And
called out. Also, not unusual.
Well, and the thing is, like, you look at it now, and all of his shit was rented. He is, like, losing money by the millions to sustain this unrealistic lifestyle that maybe, like, Elon Musk or Bill Gates can live, but that is completely unattainable for the average person, no matter how lucky you get in the stock market. And they're selling this image of success, but there's no value behind it. There's nothing there. It's smoke and mirrors. Like, and it's, in that sense, they're very interesting to look at as marketers, just because despite the fact that all of this shit is rented, like, they still have to have an income of hundreds of thousands of dollars to rent this mansion, to rent these cars, to attract these, you know, beautiful models to party with them. So there is this unassailable sense of success there, just because the resources you need to have to even sustain this illusion are immense, but at the same time, there's nothing there. Yeah. Like, they are built upon, they're building a following upon the illusion of success and using that to snowball until eventually people get bored and move on to the next rising influencer, and they crash and burn and are broken homeless.
And honestly, I would say it's possibly more terrifying when they don't move on. When you attain a level of followership, and as a leader, you choose to take these smoke and mirror, black hat, this works fast kind of tactics, and then you get people to follow you where the smoke and mirrors don't work for them, but they don't move on. They continue to look up to you. They continue to seek that success.
Well,
it actively harms them to do so. And I think that's kind of where a lot of toxicity enters into a lot of these influencer communities.
I think it's important to note the various different motivations that may drive someone to continue interacting with. So someone like, I don't want to name any names because that's not the point of this, is to call people out or anything. And some dumbass on a private recorded, you know, book club. It's not like there's any point to calling anyone out. But when you're looking at like these multi-millionaire day traders that are making these videos, like, people, they might very well be following them even after they've lost tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to this person's clubs and classes and this, that, or the other, due to sunk cost fallacy, which is a very difficult thing to divest someone of, because you were sold on this promise of it paying off eventually. If it's not paying off yet, you just haven't invested enough into it. But then on the other hand, there's someone like your typical, like Logan Paul, look at me name dropping right after I explicitly said I wouldn't, who has had this like meteoric rise to fame like 5-6 years ago, and then has just stayed there by doing different shit to keep getting attention. Mm-hmm. I would be willing to bet a not insignificant portion of his constant viewers are watching it because they think he's an insufferable prick and they want to see him fail, which is ironically fueling this rise, you know, to ever heightening heights, ever rising, you know what I mean, ever more success. Mm-hmm. And a really interesting thing about marketing is I think there are some people that have ingeniously but maliciously capitalized on the fact that there's no harmful marketing and that there's a good portion of people out there that will watch you expressly because you are horrible and awful, whether they agree with you or because they want to see you fail and want to be tuned in at every step of the ride, which ironically postpones that fall from grace that much further.
Yeah. I don't know. I definitely agree. And I think that one of the biggest things to come out of this book club session, for me at least, is the notion that there needs to be a bit of a tonal shift. Mm-hmm. Now that we're kind of getting through the growing pains of abusing the internet's communities to sell products, and we're starting to move into the idea of real, genuine connection in communities and thought leaders taking responsibility for the development of those communities. I feel like it's worth reflecting on if you're going to be a community architect, a community evangelist, any form of community manager, you really, really have to take that lesson to heart. Mm-hmm. Kind of ending the section specifically on the book itself, I thought that it was really, it really added some punch that on the very last page for chapter 17 on page 41, it was all a story about radical candor and how you could completely lose out on genius. And there's just this like faux scrawled ink in the margins that really hit me very hard emotionally. The risk of insults is the price of clarity. And I think that that's really important because I have time and time again talking to clients, talking to higher ups in companies, talking to like people who are in every right like a better marketer than I am. And yet sometimes they still make mistakes. And it's really, really hard to tell a person your baby is ugly, especially when all you want is for that baby to grow into something amazing, you know? And I kind of feel like that is a really, really important thing to keep in mind, that radical candor and choosing to risk that insult in order to make sure that things don't change or veer off beyond what was intended is really important for a community manager to know. Mm-hmm. Kind of going back to what you were saying prior about you could be in a community and then you get all of these influencers that come in and then they offer all of these silver bullet strategies, and you as a community manager really have to hold your own and say, look, we don't permit that here, please leave. And I kind of feel like this quote explains so well why that is so important and why once you have that sense of commitment, you can't back down. Put it in your community rules. Build your community charter around the very idea. Make sure that doesn't happen because the risk of insult is the price of clarity.
I didn't really take too much away from that the first time I read it, but now that you're mentioning it, like it is something that really does apply at all levels too. Like, yes, it applies to specific advertisement, but also like this broader idea of community management as a whole and how you want to run your communities and how you want to appeal to those that you are marketing to, whether via community management strategies or otherwise. Like, there's something to be said about, like, there was one time I remember we had a very blunt conversation about one of our work projects where it was the motorcycle, like the second or third revision, where I had written something that was a little too formal. You'd swung it back to be a little too informal, and we kind of butted heads over that. And I understood that mine was too formal and was having difficulty with swinging it back the other way. But then every attempt that I made to do so you thought was a little bit too academic still. And we just had this very wasn't a terse conversation. Like, I think at the end of the day, we both understood that we just wanted to see. I almost just said we wanted to see us create the most beautiful baby possible, which phrasing. We had a very
phrasing.
A very terse conversation about you were just very offended that you felt like you're making all of these changes to foster a recognizable brand voice and everything, and you didn't understand why people were coming to the table and didn't think that it was saying what you wanted it to say.
Yeah.
And I very much, to a certain extent, I had kind of the same reaction about my my version of the book, but then when someone said it's too academic and pointed out some section, I'm like, okay, yeah, no, you're right. I do that a lot.
And barring what happened after that client, I kind of feel like at the end of it all, we came into a book that we were both very, very proud of before the client got hold of it.
Well,
which I think is funny because that's another story from the book, right? What was it?
Letting, yeah. But
yeah,
the point that I wanted to bring up here was that we had this very transformative conversation that came out of that, and it was very much that there is a line that needs to be walked between being clear to the point of being boring and sanitary, and being basically straying too far into the other territory, which I think was a very good way for us to. I think it did very good things for how we approach future projects.
Yeah,
basically.
I agree. And I was actually referring in that response to Chapter 4, Uniquely Unqualified. And I think that there's a quote that does really well there. For Uniquely Unqualified, there's a quote set that says, "Advertising may be the only business in the world where the clients with the most money can make demands until they get the agency's worst product, while the small client with little to spend must meekly accept the agency's best." And I feel like that really hits home as well. Like, you need to have that conflict, but that conflict should be remaining among experts who feel like they have a specific direction. The client has a say in that. The client has a pull, but the client should not be capable of overriding the people who really honestly care for the work that's being created.
And like a little anecdote, I know we're trying not to talk about work, but I feel like by virtue of us all being marketers, like little allegories here and there about how it applies to us personally, I don't think we're going to be able to avoid those. But
no, as long as we're just not like talking about like, here's why my boss sucks.
No. You've heard very much about that. I don't need to rehash that in the midst of a book club. But I did, SEO. Basically, as an organic content, I say specialist, but they didn't let me do what I needed to do. So more like I just put up. Anywho, we're getting too far into exactly what I just said I wasn't going to do. But
that's fine.
Yay me.
Reset.
But I was an SEO specialist for a while, and not every so often, quite frequently, in fact, clients would come to me and say, "Hey, I don't like this because there's..." The most common complaint I got was not enough jargon. Like, you need to be using these keywords, blah, blah, blah. Which
is the exact opposite of what you're supposed to be
doing. It's like people within the industry aren't going to be searching for this. I'm like, okay, but you're also an HVAC repairman. People aren't going to be searching for these, like, the brands or whatever. They're going to be searching for AC repair. Like, obviously, I didn't try and rank all of the HVAC. Not going into strategies and methodology, but at the end of the day, the smaller clients or the clients whose account managers were better and were able to convince the clients to chill out, were so much more happy with the results of the marketing that they got from me, and really with the end result, than the ones who bullied us into basically giving them what they wanted because they didn't understand why it wasn't working. Like, that's just the weirdest thing to me, is this happens in a whole bunch of different industries. But, like, people recognize that they need help. They come to you for help. That's not the way we've always done it. You need to do it the way we do it. And then they wonder why they're not seeing results. It's like, because you're a dumbass and you're doing it the way that you've always done it instead of the way that works.
And I think that the notion, like, this is one thing in or this is one thing in marketing, right? Where it's like, yes, I got a client, the client has very specific ideas, you want to change their mind, and now you have to play this social politics game in order to try really hard not to hit that trigger that says, no, doing it my way, right? But then you go into a community where you're not just building content or trying to line someone's pockets or anything like that. You're actually building content that will specifically enrich the lives of the community members. And there are a million different right ways to do that. And having one person's perspective override another person's perspective goes directly against the deliberative nature of communities.
I think that that's a good point to bring up, but at the same time, sometimes people's opinions need to be overridden by those that have been doing this for a long time.
Yeah.
And have a better idea of what does and does not work. And I think there are typically hobbyist communities. I wouldn't necessarily say this for like professionally led communities, but this this opinion that my ignorance is as good as your knowledge. And I guess this does happen in professional circles as well, just with entrepreneurs and middle management that, you know, wants to be valuable to the company, C-suite that doesn't have a better idea of how things work. Like, there's very much this impression that these kind of like type A go-getters are just as capable and careful of making educated decisions as decades, you know, experts in the field with decades of experience. And I get that collaboration is important. It very much is. Nobody knows their own community. Nobody thinks they know their own communities better than the founders of them, and sometimes they're even right. But that's a that's a line that I think is going to be marketers' biggest problem to walk in the coming years as community management becomes more and more important. Like,
I think the mantra that I use for that, I don't mean to interrupt, but I kind of feel like I can kind of bring it to ground. The most important thing is making sure that all of the power players in a community, including the community manager, learn to recognize the difference between them prioritizing the lived experience, what they think is better, from the learned experience. What they've learned based off of their interactions in the community, talking to people, and actually understanding community management principles. Oftentimes, you have to recognize when your lived experience and when your learned experience is going to take precedence.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem, is there's no right answer in most situations, because in most cases it's going to be a blend of both. And figuring out when your experience kind of overrides what everyone else feels out of, I don't want to say ignorance, because that has kind of a connotation to it, but basically figuring out when what you know as an entrepreneur, as an industry leader, as this, that, or the other, overrides how other people see you, is a very important part of being a community leader, even if that's just in a figurehead position. You've got a team of community managers that are really managing things behind you. But at the same time, I think it's important that steps are made to help let people know that they are not the end-all be-all, even if they founded a community.
Yeah.
And I struggle with when to make that call, with how to make that call, with making that call in general, because like you said, it's not easy to tell people that they've built a community made of feces.
I mean, you know, it's... I mean, just because a baby is ugly does not mean it's not worthwhile, you know? Things can grow up, things can develop, things can get better.
Feces is an excellent fertilizer, but at the end of the day, it's still shit.
Your analogies make me very happy and also cringe at the same time.
I do what I can.
Yeah. But we're kind of finishing up here. We're at the 15-minute mark, so we have about 10 minutes or so. So the big question now is, and this is also expected if you're watching as a recording, if you want to take part in the book club, the most important thing that you can do is contribute to other people's learning, because this is an information diet. It's meant to be automatic. It's meant to be something that you can't escape from, even when you really want to not learn today.
And I'm sure as the past 50 minutes have shown you, we don't want to hear my dumbass ramble on for...
You're fine.
long.
Don't worry about it. It's fine. But we are moving into the last 10 minutes. So the big thing that we need to do, if you're watching or if you're a part of this at any point in time in the future, you can be 10:30 a.m. every Saturday. The most important thing that you can do is hop into the takeaways channel here on Discord and then type out, what's the big takeaway you have? What do you think is really going to impact your next week of work or of learning or of school or of whatever you have, your interactions with your community members? That's going to be an incredibly important activity that you can do that will also change someone else's life. So with that having been said, this is like the first book club session, right? So big question number one, what do you think is the biggest takeaway from Secret Formulas of the Wizard of Ads? Based off of what you've read in the first 50 pages.
Marketing doesn't have to be a slog, despite corporate attempts to sanitize and quantify best practices.
I like that. I think that my big takeaway is, at the end of the day, whether you're a community manager or a marketer or an SEO or a web designer, at the end of the day, what you call yourself is a job. Mm-hmm. It takes effort and it's difficult to do, but you do it for a reason. Don't take the magic out of what you do, or you're going to burn out quick.
I was going to say that reason is spite, but I like that better.
Fair enough. I feel like this book really underpins the magic that's involved in marketing. And the fact that we kind of remove that so often, that is one of the big takeaways that I have from the first 50 pages.
Well, it's like, look at the best example I can think of is Super Bowl commercials. Like, how many millions of people don't even watch the game, but like, oh god, the commercials are on. Like, it's the reverse of literally any other time advertising occurs. Like, growing up, advertisements in movies were always the time to go grab dinner, use the restroom, so on and so forth. But like, I don't even care about the game. I'm on the phone the entire time throughout the game because I'm a Broncos fan and we suck. But like, the advertisements, if they were that carefree and that hilariously like off the wall all the time, I think marketing as a whole would be in a much different place. Now, this does kind of go back into sanitary, socially acceptable forms of marketing services and products versus building communities. But the creative freedom that they give them to just be weird and wacky shows us that even corporate marketing does not have to be boring. We don't have to buy into that stereotype. It's the advertisements that catch your attention that are the successful ones.
Yeah. I'm kind of thinking of, like, that brings up for me the billboards where a church of some form, I don't remember what flavor, they rented a billboard that said, the end times are here, don't be a chicken. And then, of course, what restaurant is religiously affiliated and absolutely know about that billboard? Down on the bottom, all it said was sponsored by Chick-fil-A. It wasn't sponsored by Chick-fil-A. it was kind of one of those things where it's just like, yeah, that was reactive advertising. It was really solid. And another example, did you hear about the First Bank ad for cryptocurrency?
Mm-mm.
So they actually wrote, using a series of contributions to the cryptocurrency wallet, they actually wrote an ad into the cryptocurrency wallet that said, "We understand how cryptocurrency works." It cost them, on average or on whole, I think like $2,500. Don't quote me on that. This is just off the top of my head. They spent $2,500 to do this exchange, and the community for cryptocurrency just went wild. Everyone who was actually looking at the wallet saw that ad come through, and they're like, "Don't do that again." But that was hella clever. And it resulted in like a $3-4 million ad ROI for having spent just enough to put an ad in the wallet.
That is, I had an interesting talk with the guy that I'm doing computer repairs for about the corporatization of cryptocurrency, which is very much not related to this topic, but a very interesting conversation nonetheless.
Yeah. But with that, this is the end of Book Club Session 1. I hope it's helpful. I hope it's useful. Pop
Benya
into
and
the
I
takeaways.
will put our takeaways in the text channel because we follow rules.
Are you saying I won't?
I'm saying I won't, so I need to set that expectation
You're doing it.
for me.
You're doing it.
I was
You're
going to say,
doing it.
which of
Follow
us is
his-
more detail-oriented? Let's be real.
Yeah. But the gist of, and the reason why the takeaways is so important, is because the takeaways is going to be a chat channel that you have an entire history of. And it will all be one-line benefits and end-all stories about this book.
Okay,
and
I have
about
like
every other book.
3 lines, but close enough.
Put as many takeaways as you want in, just make sure that they're separate, and then as people go down, they'll learn the lesson even if they haven't read the full text of the book. So in that way, it'll be a very low-level info diet, and for high-context info diet, you can, read the book, and then you can participate here in these sessions.
Thank you for joining myself. I think I introduced myself for those that don't know me. I'm Dylan, if not. Venya and my cat shirt.
We didn't do introductions. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
but if you're in this chat, you probably already know who we are. My name is
Actually,
Benya.
I think you're the only one that I know. So, hi everyone else, I'm Dylan.
Cool. All right. So with that said, I'm going to stop the recording. I'm going to go ahead and render this out. We're going to toss it into the recording channel and then pop into the takeaways. Cool?
Ba, 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 ba,
Bam!
ba.
We will see you next week with the next 50 pages, all of part 2 for Secret Formulas of the Wizard of Ats. We look forward to hearing from you, and keep in mind, even if you don't read it, you're still welcome.
We will see you next time on the next episode of Not Being Shit at Marketing.